Dr. Rima Laibow is an incredible woman. She's a doctor, she's an activist, she's a healer. At a drug-free medical practice, she even earned the reputation as the doctor who could cure the incurable. The following interview is strong and it's scientific. Her message is clear. There is a genocidal population reduction agenda being propagated against you, against me, and against humanity. And she will be able to tell you in verifiable detail as to how exactly that is being carried out.
My name is Rima Laibow, MD, and I'm the Medical Director of the Natural Solutions Foundation. I was graduated from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York in 1970. I went to medical school in order to become a psychiatrist because it was important to me to understand how people did what they did, how they made the choices that they did, why they made the choices that they did, and how all that worked at the neurological, physiological, emotional, psychological level. And at that time, very little was understood. I became a psychoanalyst. I pursued many areas of training in order to understand how this worked. Now, at the time that I was in my residency training, the whole world of psychopharmacology, psychiatric drugs, was just opening up. The first antidepressants and the first anti-anxiety agents, the first antipsychotics were just poking their ugly heads above ground, so to speak. And I said, wait, this doesn't make sense. Every drug, psychiatric drugs included, works by poisoning enzyme systems. If you like the effects, you call it a benefit. If you don't like the effect, you call it a side effect. No drug is free of side effects. Every effect is a side effect. Nature is very thrifty, and she creates enzymes that appear all over the body. For instance, there's more serotonin and more serotonin receptor activity in the gut than there is in the brain, which is why our guts are so responsive to our emotions, by the way. And there are also serotonin receptors on the membrane that covers all of our bones, the periosteum. So when you start messing around with the enzymatic function and flow of the body, you're messing around with a lot more than the symptom that you're attempting to suppress. And I said, this makes no sense. I will not use these things on people. Because if I wouldn't use them on my mother, if I wouldn't use them on my beloved, if I wouldn't use them on my child, I won't use them on my patients. And so I became a drug-free psychiatrist because I didn't know enough about the drugs to feel confident and safe that I could administer them to people without harming them. But by that time, I was also a drug-free doctor. You see, I understood how dangerous pharmacology is to human beings. It's very, very beneficial for the pharmaceutical industry, but it's very bad for people. And so I said, I'll use the same principle that I would want used for me. Is it safe? Does it work? And do we know the long-term effects of using this or that procedure or drug? And if the answers aren't very, very comfortable, then I won't have any part in it. That meant that I had to get a good deal smarter than doctors who can just whip out a prescription pad and suppress a symptom willy-nilly. I had to learn about nutrition. I had to learn about detoxification. I had to learn about frequency, because everything is frequency after all, and if we manipulate frequency correctly, we call it frequency medicine, and we can heal with it. If we manipulate frequency incorrectly, the military calls it non-lethal weapons, which frequently are lethal, and terrible things can happen. I don't do that. I help people. And so I developed a practice in which, although my training is in psychiatry, people who were desperate whether or not they had so-called psychiatric diagnoses, came to see me. They might have cancer, they might have heart disease, they might have autoimmune disease, they might have any number of things. Generally, the people who came to see me in my office were those who were desperate and who were dying. And so my reputation spread, and I became known as a doctor who could cure the incurable. And in fact, I did very little. What I did was offer the body, the heart, the mind, and the spirit of the individual who came to see me the conditions necessary for healing. And they healed themselves, which after all is the only way that anybody ever gets healed, regardless of what the issue is. So I had a wonderful practice. I had a practice in which I was the only practitioner. I was assisted by my husband, Major General Albert N. Stubblebine III, who is trained as an engineer, but is a superb strategist. He can analyze issues and data in a brilliant way and put them together. And since the patients that I was treating came to me so that I could condition or malady, and then find a method to treat the underlying cause so that the underlying cause repaired itself and everything related to it got better, not just the one thing that they came to me for. Since that process requires a deep analysis of just what the underlying cause is, including biochemistry, psychological issues, neurological issues, energetic issues, and a host of others, he became a very active partner in the strategic analysis of the problems and finding the solutions. And he, in fact, became a technician in the work that we did with neurobiofeedback. And that technology is an extraordinarily important and very underused one, in which the brain, which after all mediates everything that happens to us, the brain is given information about how to function better. The information is feedback. When the brain does something we like, and we're listening to it by reading the EEG, the electrical impulse of the brain, and feeding that into a computer which rapidly analyzes it and tells us what's going on. When the brain does something that we think will take it in the correct direction, we say, "Yay, brain!" We give it sound, we give it light, and we give it encouragement. And the brain, which has only two functions, one is to regulate and one is to learn. The brain says, "Ooh, how did I get that very pleasant signal? How did I get that feedback? I like that. Maybe if I do more of this, I'll get more feedback. Whoops, nope, didn't work. Well, maybe if I do more of that, more feedback. Okay, I'll do more of that." And so on a voluntary basis, the brain learns how to learn to regulate the system better. And there's no part of the body, no part of the mind, the emotions, that is not regulated from above through this process. That means that there's no pathological process that isn't susceptible to being fixed by the brain fixing it. Now, I want to make the point that the brain is a transducer. It's a mechanism. It's a wet machine. That's all it is. It's consciousness, which resides outside the brain, that uses the wetware, uses the wet machine to transduce itself into physicality. And so when consciousness is invoked, and when consciousness becomes involved in the healing process, there is quite literally nothing that cannot be healed. And that's why in our office we were seeing quite regularly absolute miracles, where the cancer went away, the heart disease went away, the MS or the ALS or the neurological deficit, the autism went away, because through the combined impacts of intensive nutrition and detoxification and frequency medicine, and neurobiofeedback is a variety of frequency medicine, because you're working with the frequencies with which the cells talk to one another in the brain, which is what produces the EEG. Through the combined use of these techniques plus motivated intentionality, which is necessary to change anything, people would become well even when they had been told that they were incurable or there was no hope for them or they had to learn to live with the medication or the pain or whatever. And so my reputation spread, and people would come to me who were desperate, whether they were superstars, whether they were the plumber's wife, whether they were the head of state, whether they were the elite or the humble. People came and they said, I want to get well, and we would work together, and they would cure themselves with my assistance. It was a wonderful practice. It was satisfying, it was rewarding in every way, and I was able to teach other people what I did and how I did it, and disseminate that information. Around 2004, I became deeply concerned because I saw that there was a war being waged against us and our bodies through the method of taking away our personal freedom to make choices about our own health care, to make choices about our own food, and to make choices about what happens to our own bodies. And it became clear to me that either you own your own body or you are a slave, because whoever owns your body owns you. In the modern healthcare world, choices are made for us. We must have vaccines. We must vaccinate our children. We must take certain treatments if we get certain diseases. Children are taken away from their parents when their parents don't give them psychiatric medications or don't give them chemotherapy, even though the cancer may long since have disappeared. And there are some notably hideous cases in American jurisprudence of recent date in which that has happened. And we are losing autonomy over the right to choose clean, unadulterated food if we so wish, to have access to the natural products with which we need to treat our bodies both preventively and once something has gone wrong, and so on. And I became so concerned by this that one day I said to my husband, you know, we have to close our practice. And he said, why? And I said, because we, the health freedom side, are losing every single battle. We have no one on our side who is thinking strategically and acting tactically. All of the people on the health freedom side are either agents provocateurs, who are creating dysfunction in the health freedom movement, or they are incompetent at strategic analysis. And so after a battle has been lost, they run around waving their hands in the air and saying, ooh, 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 isn't that terrible, when it's too late to do anything. I said, we will lose every battle. We will have no clean food. We will have no natural health. Codex Alimentarius will destroy the population and our fertility by weaponizing our food on a global basis. And because we know that this is happening, if we elect to do nothing, then we become part of the evil. Evil? Yes, evil. Because this is all motivated by a clear, well-articulated, and very well-developed genocidal agenda. As hard to believe as it was back then in 2004, lots of people understand now that there is a genocidal depopulation agenda, which I call a war against the population of the earth. The World Health Organization, the United States government, the Council on Foreign Relations, the United Nations, and many other similar organizations have joined together in a shared vision. It's a wonderful vision. It's the vision of a sustainable planet There will be blue skies everywhere. There will be clean, limpid water running everywhere. There will be green grass, and there will be cows lowing peacefully in the distance. And you and I and our children and our children's children will no longer exist. We will not be there to appreciate this beautiful, sustainable world because we will have been eliminated by the elite, by the globalists, since we, in their vision, are useless eaters. Useless eaters, their term of art for us. We, they say, consume their non-renewable natural resources. We, they say, are not needed for what they call the neo-feudal world, in which, as was explained to me by a head of state who was my patient and who told me this in my office, there will be a small circle of neo-aristocrats at the top, surrounded by their servants and servitors, who are in turn surrounded by their technicians, which takes about 10% of the current world population. Everyone else, she said, will be culled. C-U-L-L-E-D. The weak will be killed for the benefit of the strong. Her statement, her belief system, my call to action, your call to action too. Unless, of course, that's okay with you. Most people do not believe that they're useless eaters. I've gone around the world asking people on camera, are you a useless eater? And they say, a what? And I explain the concept to them and they say, no, I'm not a useless eater. My children and I have every right to live on this planet. This planet belongs to us. And they're right. It does not belong to the elite. They are wrong. In my estimation, they are psychopaths. They're quite mad. They're powerful, and they control the means of communication, transportation, and production, but they're crazy as bedbugs. And it's up to us, the people who are not crazy as bedbugs, to take our own future into our own hands and assure it for ourselves. There is plenty of food on this planet. There is plenty of water on this planet, and there are not too many people. The myth of overpopulation was funded by John D. Rockefeller Jr. and his friends in order to make it okay to kill lots and lots and lots of people. It's a myth. And if you look a little into the history of John D. Rockefeller Jr., you will find that he was the person who introduced the idea of eugenics, of culling the herd, killing the weak, getting rid of the undesirable, to Germany. He funded the two Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes, one in Berlin and one in Munich, when the ruler of Germany was not Adolf Hitler, but Kaiser Wilhelm. That's why they named it after him. And he was the one who brought eugenics to the United States. Tens and tens of thousands of so-called undesirables were involuntarily sterilized at his behest. It goes on and on. But the point is, the history of depopulation and the history of John D. Rockefeller and the Rockefeller dynasty are inextricably linked. It's not okay with me, and I'm quite sure it's not okay with you, to depopulate the planet for the sake of the few elites who have decided that that makes sense. Back to my statement that they're crazy as bedbugs. They are psychopaths. They have no allegiance or affiliation with anything or any being that is not directly of service to them. Most of us live life a little differently. Now, the inputs that we are receiving, and that is to say contaminated food, degraded and devitalized food through the agency of Codex Alimentarius, a United Nations commission run jointly by the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization, which, like the Federal Reserve of the United States, are private corporations, and they serve their funding masters. Just as an aside, who is it, do you think, that funds the World Health Organization? the same people that declared a level 6 highest level pandemic in the swine flu debacle and wanted to vaccinate everybody against the genetically engineered swine flu with vaccines that would cause permanent infertility. Let's see, who pays the tab for the WHO? 70% of their funds come directly from the pharmaceutical industry. There might be a connection between what they say, what they push, and who funds them. There certainly is in most other cases. At any rate, WHO and the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, have been the overseeing bodies that allow the world's food to become degraded, devitalized, and incapable of supporting life and healthy biological processes. In fact, in 2002, these two organizations issued a special report in which they identified the fact that billions of people are likely to die eating the devitalized, demineralized, and nutrition-poor food that Codex Alimentarius makes legal and supports on a global basis, because they identify the non-communicable, preventable diseases of undernutrition that are the main killers. They identify cancer, cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, and obesity as the diseases that will result in billions of preventable deaths by the year 2050. The food that Codex Alimentarius is pushing forward does not sustain life. That's the point. That's one of the inputs. It's rich in chemicals, which are poisonous. It's rich in toxins of other kinds, which are permitted, and it's poor in nutrients. People get sick, and then they die. And that's the point. Now, Codex Alimentarius is responsible for the globalization of food that does not sustain health and life. So toxic food is one of the inputs that is changing our genetic structure and making us sicker than ever before at younger and younger ages, actually reducing our lifespan and certainly reducing our health span. But there are others. The globalists are quite content to have you vaccinated hundreds of times during your lifespan. Now, vaccination has always been taught to us as one of the absolutely unchallengeable good things of civilization. But what about polio? We've wiped out polio, haven't we, with the polio vaccine? No, as a matter of fact, we haven't. And if you look on the CDC website under polio, infantile paralysis, you will find several interesting things. First of all, you'll find that the only polio that is occurring is polio post-vaccination. That polio is being spread around the world through vaccination with the polio vaccine. You'll also find that the increase in childhood leukemia is directly attributable to the use of polio vaccine, which, like many other vaccines, is rich in a virus called SV40. Comes from monkey kidneys. And since the polio vaccine is cultured in monkey kidney tissues, the virus is included in the vaccine. They could filter it out, but as Maurice Hilleman, the head of Merck vaccine development, says in a video that you can watch for yourself on YouTube, it was simply too expensive to bother filtering out the leukemia virus, and therefore it was allowed to stay in. And he laughs, and the people in the lecture that he's giving laugh with him. If your child dies of leukemia, I don't imagine you'll laugh. This is knowingly being done. Vaccines are ineffective, they are dangerous, and they are entirely without scientific background, without scientific validity. There is no excuse for any vaccine. Shocking? Might be, but that's the reality. That's the truth. That's what the science tells us, not the pseudoscience. If you start looking into the history of vaccines, which change our genetic makeup, you'll find that they were born in fraud, perpetrated in fraud, and live as a major scientific fraud. Each vaccine is filled with horrifyingly toxic materials that damage the immune system, and according to internal documents, public under Freedom of Information Act litigation, the purpose of vaccines is to make money in the aftermarket. The aftermarket is cancer, diabetes, infertility, and other cataclysmic but very, very financially productive diseases. The pharmaceutical industry would prefer that you not be healthy, because if you're healthy, they're not making any money. The pharmaceutical industry does not see itself as a health industry. That's the propaganda that they put out. They see themselves as a financial organism that profits when you're ill, and they sell you expensive nostrums to keep you sick and require you to use other nostrums. Don't believe me? Look at the literature. Look at the reality. Do some research. That's the reality of the pharmaceutical industry. Oh yes, the pharmaceutical industry goes back to John D. Rockefeller. You see, around the turn of the 20th century, John D. Rockefeller did not believe that the internal combustion engine would consume all of his output of oil, and he controlled virtually every drop of oil that was produced on planet Earth. So he sent his agents out looking for something else to consume the oil that he was producing, what was left over by the internal combustion engine. And what he did was discover, or his agents discovered, that the pharmaceutical industry used coal tar, the stuff left over at the bottom of the cracking towers that are used to separate crude oil into petroleum that's used for your car and so on. That these companies used coal tar to make coal tar derivatives. Almost all drugs at that time were coal tar derivatives. They were synthesized in an organic chemistry laboratory. And he said, cool, I own all the coal tar in the world. So he had his agents buy controlling interests in all of the German pharmaceutical industry. Now, at that time, the pharmaceutical industry was located almost exclusively in Germany. So he owned the controlling interest in the pharmaceutical industry, and he said, okay, what am I going to do with this? And he created conventional allopathic medicine as we know it today to be pill pushers. He gave $1 million, which back around the turn of the 20th century was a considerable amount of money. He gave $1 million to each state in the United States. And he said, set up a medical board that makes it a crime to practice medicine without a license. Because you see, at that time, people who practiced herbal medicine and homeopathy and chiropractic and osteopathy all had licenses. And they were told, turn in your licenses or go to jail. He also gave $1 million to each state to set up a medical school on their land-grant college. And he gave an extra $1 million to Harvard and an extra $1 million to Yale so that they would be elite medical schools, leading the pack. He set up the Rockefeller Institute, and the head of the Rockefeller Institute was a guy whose job was, in writing, to promulgate and propagate pharmaceutical medicine and the pharmaceutical industry. He was named Ephraim Flexner. He had a brother, and his brother was named Abram Flexner. John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie funded a study, supposedly an independent study, but you know how those things go. The answer was already predetermined according to the documentation that we have. Abram Flexner did a study to figure out what the real medicine was that was available in the United States. Was it homeopathy? Was it herbalism? Was it chiropractic? Was it osteopathy? Why, no. It was allopathic medicine. You know, the kind that uses drugs. And so the medical schools were shaped and were developed with the support of the medical boards to train pill pushers. Period. End of discussion. Very elegant, very elaborate, very highfalutin training. Brainwashing. Having lived through it, I can tell you, it is nothing short of brainwashing. There's sleep deprivation, there's protein deprivation, there's shame, there's guilt, there's more stress than you can possibly imagine. And at the end, what you're supposed to do is kowtow to the wisdom of your elders and seek their approval throughout your entire life, raising yourself in the ranks of the elite by being patted on the head every time you satisfy their demands and meet their standards. Publish a paper, get an appointment at a university, and so on. But what you're not supposed to do is think. Ever. That may not be the way you think about your doctor. And I guarantee you it's not the way your doctor thinks about your doctor. But I also guarantee you that it's the fact. Medical training is a brainwashing procedure designed to produce compliant, well puffed up pill pushers, one way or another. Because anybody who stops to think about drugs understands that they too poison your genome. They too damage the long-term viability of the human race. That's a strong statement, and it's a very important statement. And then there's radiation. Now, we were told that radiation, nuclear radiation and nuclear fission, was going to provide energy that was so cheap, so abundant, so safe, that it could never go wrong, that nothing could ever disturb and overcome the safety factors built into nuclear power stations, and that it would be too cheap to monitor. Energy would just be given away free. That was their definition of free energy, which, by the way, does exist and has, by the way, been brutally suppressed for quite obvious reasons for more than 100 years. So nuclear power stations were built. Now, it turns out that nuclear power stations are enormously expensive, but power companies are granted rates or income on the basis of how expensive their facilities are. The more expensive, the better. Not necessarily the more efficient, and certainly not necessarily the safer. There is no way to make a safe nuclear power plant. I think Fukushima makes that quite obvious. But if you look at nuclear stations all over the world, you'll see that every station leaks radioactive material. Every one. And so the atomic energy commissions of the world have a mantra: no harm to human health, no harm to human health, no harm. Doesn't make any sense. It's a magical mantra that they chant over and over again, no matter what happens. No harm to human health. Balderdash. There is no safe nuclear power. There is no safe level of radiation. We get a little of it from the cosmic radiation. We get a little of it from the decay of things like potassium-40 and the naturally occurring isotopes. And because it's only a little, and because we're meant to have high levels of antioxidants from our diet and from our internal processes when they're uncontaminated by toxins, we are able to repair the damage to the genome most of the time. But when that damage is overwhelming, and we have damage from our food, and we have damage from vaccines, and we have damage from drugs, and we have damage from radiation, we can't repair it. And so what's happening is that our genome is being distorted and distorted. Our genome is the total sum of the DNA in our bodies. And it is our heritage. It is our past, it is our present, and it is our future. When that genome is damaged, that damage has unknown consequences, and those consequences are passed forward to our offspring if there are offspring. And there are fewer and fewer offspring. More and more women are infertile, more and more men are sterile. And then there's genetically modified food. Now, when you hear the phrase genetically modified food, it would be wise to immediately change the last word in your mind from F-O-O-D to P-H-U-D-E. It sounds like food, looks like food, might even taste similar to food, but it doesn't sustain life. Genetically modified food is horrifyingly dangerous. Genetically modified food may not be labeled in the United States under the regulation and laws of the FDA. It is forbidden to identify genetically modified food as such in the United States. Why? Because according to Dr. Barbara Schneemann in October of 2008 in a special Codex meeting, which I attended, along with General Stubblebine in Oslo, Norway, the FDA has decided that genetically modified food is substantially equivalent to unmodified food. Consumers, over 90% of them, don't want genetically modified food, and therefore, to prevent them from making an error in their food selection, the FDA has decided to prevent consumers from knowing which food is genetically modified and which food is not genetically modified in order to prevent them from making that error. That happens to be illegal under Western States versus Shalala, which went to the Supreme Court and set precedent-setting case law. No government agency has the right to do that, to inhibit free speech and to inhibit the flow of information. But the FDA, or as I call it, the Fraud and Death Administration, seems to believe that it is above the law and is unbounded by either the legal restraints placed upon it or the Constitution of the United States. At any rate, they forbid the labeling of food with genetically modified ingredients as such. In addition to which, it might be interesting for you to know that the FDA is forbidden from examining any safety reports on genetically modified food, PHUDE, other than a preliminary safety assessment by the company that holds the patent. So Monsanto or Pfizer or Syngenta or some other GMO company, Bayer Crop Sciences, says, yep, this is safe. Yep, safe. We did laboratory studies and it's safe. And the FDA says, okay, there you go. And may not examine any other studies, may not conduct any other studies. The FDA's own scientists have been horrified by this and have repeatedly asked the FDA not to permit these foods into the marketplace. The consequences are unknown in the main. Where they are known, they are universally bad. They cause infertility, they cause sterility, they cause lethal allergies that have never existed before, they cause cancer, they cause a whole variety of absolutely horrible diseases and conditions. They are damaging the genome of the human population. And so, by the way, is the chemtrailing that's going on. If you are still among the number of people who look up at the sky and see long arching trails, plumes of white or black, and say, well, that must be normal. That's how airplanes leave trails. Those are contrails. Then you are in coma, because that's not normal. A contrail is short and dissipates rapidly. A chemtrail is a phenomenon created by the internal deposition of toxic elements into the sky. How do I know? Because people have measured what's coming down. People have measured the amount of aluminum, arsenic, cadmium, beryllium in the soil. People have measured and identified in laboratory analysis the nanobots and the other non-natural ingredients, including synthetic DNA and genetically modified viruses. Urban legend? Believe so at your own peril. Do a little research. Look into chemtrails, and you will find that up until a year or so ago, the United States government denied that there was any such phenomenon. Now they admit there is such a phenomenon because of the public voice demanding to know what was going on. And they explain it this way. Well, you see, we have to modify the weather in order to keep you safe from global warming. Modify the weather. Do you know enough about the weather to modify it? Do you understand enough about the planet to understand what dropping vast amounts of aluminum on the soil does? Do you really? Because if you do, you know that you're carrying out genocide. Do you, government of the US or any other government, really understand what creating an epidemic of Morgellons disease is doing to people? That you are changing the genetic expression of the entire DNA reservoir of the entire human population. Is that really okay with you? Well, I'm so glad for you. It's not okay with me, and it's my DNA. Now, according to the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, slavery and indentured servitude are no longer legal in the United States. That means that I own my body, you own yours. It also means that my DNA is not available to you to manipulate or use without my permission. So when genetically modified food, PHUDE, is put forward and given to people to eat and changes my DNA without my permission, or experimentally subjects me to conditions that I did not agree to with informed consent. The same thing is true of agribiz products that don't support life, when the same thing is true of dangerous radioactive contamination that is put forth into the atmosphere, the water, and into my food without my participating in a permission statement, then you are violating my legal right to own and maintain my own body. Well, the FDA sees things a little differently. Of course, they say that I have no legal right to eat what I want. I have no legal right to know what's in my food. And I have no legal right to choose what is good for me. Only they have the right. And they said this in a court case over raw milk. They presented a brief that said that no one has a right to determine their own best interest and make their own choices. It was a shocking but not surprising demonstration of official globalist idiocy. You see, logic is not the issue here. The issue is dominance and depopulation. And when you are promulgating dominance and depopulation, which are illogical things to bring forward on the planet, you wind up saying and doing illogical things. If you think you're powerful enough, it doesn't really matter. The truth of the matter is, the dirty little secret that the globalists do not want you to know is that they're not powerful. They're actually very weak. They're very vulnerable. How do we know that? Because each and every time, without exception, that the people of this planet mobilize their outrage in a positive and effective way, and I'll give you some examples in a moment, each and every time that they mobilize their outrage, the globalists step back. They don't step forward, they retreat. I'll give you an example. On September 15th, 2009, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, sat before the United States Congress, and she announced that because of the swine flu pandemic, the level 6 pandemic that had been declared, and by the way, according to the World Health Organization and the United Nations charters and treaties, when a level 6 pandemic is declared, the governance of the planet devolves to the World Health Organization. We're talking about one world government, the New World Order. Well, they declared a level 6 pandemic in June of 2009. And they said, you're going to die, unless you take our vaccine. Subtext, in which case you're going to die or be infertile. And Kathleen Sebelius sat in front of the Congress of the United States and she said, we are going to vaccinate every man, woman, and child in the United States with the swine flu vaccine. Now, it's true we don't have enough swine flu vaccine, so we're going to extend it with something called squalene. Footnote: squalene is a normal part of the human nervous system. It's part of the insulation of the nerves that make transmission of electrical impulses possible. However, when squalene is injected into your blood, it causes profound, pervasive, and irreversible autoimmune disease. In fact, if you want to give a laboratory animal a massive autoimmune condition, you inject squalene, in which case it is known as Freund's adjuvant, because it causes such a massive inflammatory autoimmune disease that the animal is a perfect laboratory model for you. So, injected squalene is quite a problem. There's another problem with injected squalene. If you inject enough, you cause irreversible immune-mediated infertility. Depopulation comes to mind. And so, Kathleen Sebelius said to the Congress of the United States, in order to extend the amount of flu vaccine that we have so that everybody can get their vaccine at one of 90,000 vaccine administration sites, school gyms and the basements of churches and other sanitary places. In order to do that, we're going to extend the vaccine with an adjuvant called squalene, which has never been approved for use in a vaccine because it's too toxic to inject. But we're going to change that. And in fact, the U.S. government has spent $500 million on a supply of squalene that is sufficient to inject everyone with. And oh yes, according to 2 patents held by the United States government, we know, but Kathleen Sebelius failed to mention, the amount that is planned to be injected into every man, woman, and child in the United States is enough to cause irreversible sterility and infertility. The Congress of the United States, ever gutless and spineless, said, okay, that sounds like a plan. We found out about it at the Natural Solutions Foundation, and we said it sounds like a plan for depopulation. We don't think so. And we told our supporters about it, our hundreds of thousands of supporters, and they told their friends, as we asked them to. Within 11 days, 3.5 million emails reached the White House, Kathleen Sebelius, every member of the Congress of the United States, every state senator, every state governor. We said, don't you dare. And they didn't. They stepped back. Because there were so many emails, because there were so many voices raised together with one message, don't you dare. And they didn't dare. We've done that repeatedly through the Natural Solutions Foundation. Our website, by the way, is www.globalhealthfreedom.org or www.savemylifedrrima.com. A little dramatic, perhaps? Not dramatic at all. Accurate. Because that's what's at stake, your life. And it's information and action that will save your life. There are people who are at war with you. War has been declared upon the human population. People say, how can you possibly say a terrible thing like that? I don't want my children to hear that there is a war consciousness. Okay, here's my question to you. If somebody wants to kill you and your children without ever having met them, what would you call it besides a war? If somebody is bringing massive resources to bear on exterminating you and your genetic line, what would you call it besides a war? It certainly isn't patty cakes. These people are serious, they're well organized, and they're deadly. As I said earlier, they're crazy as bedbugs, because anybody who will carry out genocide is, by my definition, as a psychiatrist, nuts. Lethal and nuts. So this is no game. This is no joke. This is no hobby for these people. This is a clear and well-organized priority with all kinds of lovely public relations trappings, bows, ribbons, whistles, and nonsense. They'll tell you anything that they think you want to hear. They'll feed you any kind of nonsense. Recently, a study came out saying that organic food has no more nutrients, no more antioxidants, and is actually worse for you than conventional food, which is filled with chemicals and genetically modified dangers. Turns out that the guy who wrote it has long ties to the agribiz industry and is nothing but a prostitute with a PhD after his name. His money comes from the people whose boots he is licking, and we're supposed to believe it. The pseudoscience is everywhere. Common sense prevails. How can it possibly be that chemical food is better for you than real food? The answer is it can't be. Now, there is another issue that needs to be talked about, and that is that this disruption of the genetic system, which I have labeled GDS, Genome Disruption Syndrome. And you're welcome to go to www.gds-therapy.com and read about genome disruption. It's clear that there's a genocidal agenda. It's clear that the attacks on us are quite intentional. I mean, think about it. When a new drug is approved by the FDA in the United States, the aforementioned Fraud and Death Administration, it goes not into full approval, but into a phase 4 clinical trial. Now, a phase 4 clinical trial is a trial in which the drug is made available for general use in the public, and the FDA waits to see how many people die, are maimed, or have other serious consequences called adverse events. About 1% of the adverse events that a drug causes or a vaccine causes are reported. That means that 100 times more adverse events occur. If the adverse event is too frequent, even for the FDA, within 5 years, the drug is quietly, usually, withdrawn from the market. It failed the phase 4 testing. Now that's interesting. Most people don't know that approximately 50% of the drugs approved by the FDA are withdrawn quietly within 5 years because they're too toxic. They kill too many people properly used. They're lethal. It's beyond my comprehension, and I have a wide comprehension, that that's an accident. It's beyond my comprehension that the FDA scientists, who are good and honorable people, constantly recommend against the approval of a device or a drug or a vaccine or a substance, and the FDA approves it. Panels are convened, which are composed of people who have personal, scientific, and or financial interest in the thing that they are giving approval to, and they approve it anyway. The United States government has, in essence, eliminated the concept of conflict of interest. Now, you could say this is bad management, this is poor thinking, this is callous disregard of the public welfare. But you'd be wrong. It is all of those, plus an understanding by the pharmaceutical industries and the other multinational corporations that it is part of their global well-being, paradoxically, to reduce the population. It's just one example. You see, the people in the US government rotate through a revolving door policy, which is official policy, into the industry that they're regulating, then out of the industry and back into government, where they regulate to the benefit of themselves and their friends, and around they go. The revolving door policy allows the increasing merger of the state and the corporation. You see, Benito Mussolini defined fascism for us as the merger of the corporation and the state. And in the United States, we have achieved that rather unwholesome merger, so that corporate interests are served by the government interests are served by the corporations, and they are the same. The globalists have for a very long time, long before they had that name, the globalists have decided that the population must be severely and significantly reduced. They've decided who may live and who may die. And they are using tools for accomplishing their genocidal agenda, which have familiar names. Food, laced with chemicals. Agro-food, that is grown with poisonous petrochemicals and is grown in devitalized soil and will not support health. Because in the face of environmental contamination, you need more minerals, not less. Codex, the FDA, and their equivalent numbers in other countries that are part of this agenda are doing everything they can to severely restrict, limit, lower the amount of nutrients that you are permitted either through supplementation or in your food. The genocidal agenda is continued through GMOs. Every independent scientist who has ever looked at genetically modified food, transgenicos in Spanish, GMOs in English, every one of them has found, sometimes to their astonishment, because they started out believing in the technology, that genetically modified foods introduce foreign genes into our body, into the bacteria of our gut, which are 80% or more of our immune system, into our own cells, into the cells of fetuses, and those genes jump around and do things that are unexpected, usually very bad, sometimes lethal. Not only do they cause serious, clinically significant allergies, but they also cause infertility, they cause cancer, they cause autoimmune disease, they cause fetal malformations, they cause any number of things. Of course, the chemicals that are then dumped on the GMO crops, because the crops are generally modified to withstand a particular chemical that the company that modifies the seeds makes, so they can sell more of their chemical, their pesticide or their herbicide. That chemical is now enriched in the food. For instance, glyphosate, commonly known as Roundup, the most widely used herbicide in the world, is regarded by toxicologists as the second most toxic non-radioactive compound on the planet because of the health effects, or I should say the predictable illness effects that it causes. Just head the list with cancer and go down every serious consequence from there. And that's where you are. You see, there's a cartel. I call it the Uber cartel. The pharmaceutical medical industry is one stop on the cycle. The pharmaceutical industry manufactures not only drugs, but agrochemicals. Those agrochemicals are enormously profitable. They poison us, of course, but they're profitable. They are also the biotech companies. They manufacture the genetically engineered seeds and animals, which can withstand lots more of their chemicals. So farmers buy lots more of their chemicals. And those chemicals and the GMO foods make us terribly sick, make us infertile, give us cancer, leukemia, and so on and so on. And then we are, because natural medicine is being suppressed around the world, we are driven into the arms of the pharmaceutical medical cartel. How convenient. It's a cycle. It's a cycle of death. Are the companies innocent of this knowledge? Not at all. Remember John D. Rockefeller Jr. and the pharmaceutical cartel? I would point out to you that during the Nuremberg tribunals, which the US, Britain, and Russia held jointly, following the Second World War, because we were going to hold those criminals against humanity to justice. The heads of the great German civilian war machine, called IG Farben, the head guys who went to jail for, as long as almost 4 years, the head guys, the guys who built Auschwitz and the slave labor camps, the guys who experimented on human beings and tortured them hideously to death. They were all pharmaceutical executives. Fritz Termeer is a good example. He was the head of Bayer, or as we say in the United States, Bayer, now known as Bayer Pharmaceutical and Bayer Crop Sciences. Remember the cartel that we talked about. Fritz Termeer was tapped to be the head of IG Farben. He went to jail for creating the conditions of human slavery and torture, for building Auschwitz and the Auschwitz slave labor camp, which was even bigger than Auschwitz. And oh, by the way, neither Auschwitz nor the slave labor camp were ever bombed. Interesting. At any rate, he went to jail. And he was in jail along with his pharmaceutical cronies for about 4 years. Got out of jail, went back to work as the head of Bayer Pharmaceutical. No loss of pay, I assume. I guess he got a haircut and clean, shiny shoes and a fresh suit. And he went back to work. And he called back together the other pharmaceutical guys he had been in jail with and he had been colleagues with before that. And he said, well, that obviously didn't work. What can we do now? That being the genocide that was intended to be spread across the world. And they said to each other, I know, food. We can control people with food. We can determine whether they live or whether they die. What a great idea. Pharmaceutical makers are also agrochemical makers. Yes. And so they got together and they wrote a letter to the United Nations. The letter was delivered in 1952. Out of that impulse, saying that the United Nations, a globalist organization, should control the world food supply, came the Codex Alimentarius Commission, a globalist tool for depopulation through profitable activities. Now, I have attended many Codex meetings. They're boring, they're technical, they're grim, until one moment when there's blood on the floor, so to speak, and somebody, the People's Republic of China or Iran or some other country that has noticed some terrible thing is happening, raises an opposition point. And other countries sometimes join in. And then there is procedural blood on the floor. The chairman fights as hard as he can, or she can, against the tide of dissent in order to fulfill the requirements and wishes of the United States, because the dominant dog in Codex is the United States. What happens generally is that whatever genuine opposition is present is bowled across and is steamrollered. I'll give you an example. In Thailand, I attended the Committee on Special Foods, which is a very important committee, I attended the meeting of the Committee on Dietary Supplements and Foods for Special Uses. And the United States was firmly in favor of adding large amounts of fluoride to infant formula. This is a very bad idea. Even the World Health Organization says that babies 1 year and under should not be exposed to fluoride in water, formula, or food. And the United States, as always, has disregarded this particular piece of health advice and was demanding that baby formula be fortified with high levels of fluoride. I got wind of this. I prepared a scientific dossier with hundreds of references showing that this was a really bad idea, and I passed it out to the African delegates. I passed it out to the Asian delegates. I passed it out to the delegates of the emerging nations. And I said to them, stand with South Africa. South Africa will oppose this, and you must oppose it too. They said, do we have fluoride in our country? I said, it doesn't matter. Nestle has fluoride in their formula. So do the other companies, and they will poison your people. They said, righto then. And so when the issue came up, there was an absolute riot on the floor. The chairman was ignoring the speakers. The speakers push a button, a light goes on, the chairman acknowledges them electronically, and they're able to be heard. The chairman refused to acknowledge any of the dissenting countries. The speakers, on my advice, stood and screamed their contribution. There was a riot on the floor. Finally, the chairman said that the proposal was not accepted and moved on to the next item. The very last moment of the meeting, the United States raised its electronic hand, and of course its button was pushed so they could be heard. And Dr. Barbara Schneemann, who was the representative of the United States to Codex at that and many meetings, said, Mr. Chairman, we have not allowed fluoride to be added to the formulas of healthy babies, but we did not act on the formulas for sick babies and babies with special needs. And the chairman said, approved by consensus, fluoride may be added at this level to the formula of babies with special needs and sick babies. Meeting adjourned. That's cataclysmic for those babies, but it's very typical of the way that the agenda is advanced for the corporate, statist, globalist, genomocidal agenda. Now, we talk about genomocidal. The genome is the total genetic material of a human being. The collective genome, of course, is the total genetic material of the human race or of the entire biological sphere of the planet. Depends what you're talking about. When we talk about our genome, we talk about our genetic history, because our genes tell us where we've been. We're talking about our genetic present, and we're talking about our genetic future. Not only our personal genetic future, what happens in my body in the next minute, the next hour, the next decade, the next 20, 30, 50, 70 years. We're also talking about any future generations, because if my genes are changed and I reproduce, those changes will be passed to my offspring. There are technologies which are being used, which are profitable because the situation has been sculpted to allow them to be profitable, but which are deadly because the overarching agenda of the globalists is the reduction of the population by 90%. They say it, not my imagination. Their documents on sustainability make that point. National Security Memorandum 200, written for President Nixon in 1974 by Henry Kissinger, who was at that time the head of the Department of State, the Secretary of State, says population reduction must be the primary goal of U.S. foreign policy. That was accepted by Nixon's administration and was never refuted or revoked as a policy statement of U.S. government foreign policy. There you have it. You also have it in all of the sustainability documents of the United Nations and the World Health Organization. They make it sound beautiful. It's glowing, it's beautiful, it's lovely, it's depopulation, it's genocide, it's death for you and your family and your future. And if you can't reproduce, that's death for future generations. Bill Gates is generously handing out billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of vaccines. Did you know that although the whitewash of the U.S. government is very enthusiastic, the facts are very clear? Autism is directly related to thimerosal, which is almost 50% mercury by weight in injections put into bodies, tiny bodies, bigger bodies. It's terribly, terribly neurotoxic. We know that. At the same time, did you know that generous Mr. Gates vaccines in Africa and Asia and South America have twice as much mercury as our vaccines? Why is that? As a matter of fact, the High Court, the equivalent of the U.S. Supreme Court in the Philippines, convicted the World Health Organization of genocide because they involuntarily sterilized more than 3 million Filipino women. No one knows how many except the World Health Organization. How did they do that? They injected them with what they called a tetanus vaccine. And those women will never have children. I have in my possession a World Health Organization document, which I have put online, from 1985, which says that the smallpox eradication program had another purpose. The real purpose was to render so many women infertile in Africa, in black Africa, that it would, and I quote, eliminate 150 million excess sub-Saharan Africans. I submit to you that for any decent human being, there is no such thing as an excess human being. By definition, according to me, the people who wrote this document and who created the vaccines and who administered them cannot be considered decent human beings. I don't care how elevated or lofty their position is, how excellent their PR is. Let's be clear about this. The myth of overpopulation is a Rockefeller-created myth. John D. Rockefeller founded and funded the population pressure organizations. I must admit I was taken in by this. When I was younger, I used to send them money because I believed that there was such a thing as overpopulation. Turns out it's an excuse to eliminate excess human beings. The document that I referred to that Henry Kissinger wrote says that depopulation should begin in the third world. And then you're next. Maybe you like being under control. Maybe it's okay with you. Maybe being a slave works for you. Maybe having someone tamper with your DNA without your permission on an experimental basis really works for you. And it's okay for your kids to be vaccinated. And it's okay for you to have to submit to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices adult vaccine schedule. And it's okay to take a flu shot and increase your chances of Alzheimer's disease by 600% if you have 5 consecutive flu shots during your life. Maybe that works for you. In that case, I don't want to invite you to dinner. I don't want to talk to you. But if you're an awake, alert human being, it's not okay with you. And it's not okay when it's done to anybody else. Problems are personal, they're local, they're regional, and they're global. So you need to take care of your body. You also need to take care of the body politic. The Natural Solutions Foundation, of which I am proud to be the medical director, understands that there are personal choices to be made, and there are national choices, and there are international choices. And it is our voice, collectively, that makes those choices a reality. Without our active, aggregated voices, the globalists can do whatever they want, and what they want is get rid of us. One of the things that the Natural Solutions Foundation is doing is creating a low radiation food source for people in North America who have not yet figured out that the only way to be safe from the nuclear contamination of Fukushima is to get out. I hope that by the time they do figure it out, the other countries of the world in the safe areas, the lower radiation areas of the southern hemisphere, do not bar them. Think about it. If you were a country, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, a low radiation country, and you were getting a flood of immigrants from the high radiation northern hemisphere, knowing that their personal household goods were contaminated, their clothing was contaminated, that their bodies were contaminated, and that they were in large number going to develop cancer and cardiovascular disease and neurological dysfunction, and put a huge drain on the health system when they came to live in the new country. After a time, wouldn't you say we don't want these people? I don't know whether the borders will close in the southern hemisphere low radiation countries. I suspect that they will. So if you want to emigrate, there are 2 webinars which General Stubblebine, the president of the foundation, has made available on low radiation migration. They're worth watching. It's important for you to seriously ask whether your avoidance includes avoidance of the inevitable contamination in your food, in your water, and in your air. If you're in the northern hemisphere, you are being contaminated. Daily, the reports come to us of how high the drinking water levels are, of how high the green leafy vegetable contamination with plutonium and uranium and cesium-137, which, by the way, attacks the heart muscle, and a host of other radioactive isotopes. Fukushima Daiichi is a disaster of more than biblical proportion, and there is no way that we know of yet to stop it. And so it goes with each of the issues. There are personal protections to be had, and there are community protections to be engaged in. They can't be separated. No man truly is an island. We are connected. We are connected by our own energy. We are connected by our own humanity. And we are connected by our own vulnerability to what's being brought upon us, to what's being shoved upon us, to what's being given to us and what's being withheld from us. We don't have to be. We are fundamentally free beings. We have free will, and we can exercise that free will to make things happen the way we want. Let me suggest that you get serious about solutions. Our middle name is Solutions, the Natural Solutions Foundation. We discover, we document, we develop, and we disseminate solutions. I suggest that you become interested in those solutions too, and I invite you to join us for those solutions and to become an active agent in sharing those solutions as well as using them for your own well-being and that of the people that you love. Pharmaceutical industry, which is the agrobiz industry, which is the biotech industry, which is the medical industry, is, according to Forbes magazine and Fortune 500, the single most profitable industry on the planet. The top 10 pharmaceutical companies make more profit in an average year than the next 490 companies globally in the aggregate. What that means is that the pharmaceutical industry is more profitable than war and oil combined.
So now you know. You know how we're being attacked. If we don't all come together and act and take action to stop this from happening, what hope do we have? It's not important what you do or even how you do it. What's important is that you do something, anything.